Therapy Chat Podcast, episode 247.
This is the Therapy Chat Podcast with Laura Reagan, LCSW-C. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. And now, here's your host, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C.
Today's episode is sponsored by Therapy Notes. Between writing notes, filing insurance claims, and scheduling with clients, it can be hard to stay organized. That's why I recommend Therapy Notes. Their easy-to-use platform lets you manage your practice securely and efficiently. Visit therapynotes.com to get 2 free months of Therapy Notes today. Just use the promo code TherapyChat when you sign up for a free trial at therapynotes.com. Hello, Therapy Chat listeners. This is your host, Laura Reagan. It is late September, and I am recording an introduction to an interview that I did back in early February 2020. So right now, it's almost October 2020. By the time you're hearing this, it will be October. And a lot changed between early February and now. So when I was recording this interview with my guest, Gracy Obuchowicz, neither of us realized that in 5 or 6 weeks, we would be quarantining, staying at home because of coronavirus. So I think our interview is as timely now as it was then, and the need for self-care may be even more evident to you than it was before. So I hope you'll find it helpful. And there may be some things in our interview which sound out of touch with our current situation because it wasn't happening at that time. So just listen, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Gracy talking about her approach to self-care using Ayurvedic principles. As always, I appreciate you listening. More new content will be coming in the weeks ahead as I took a little break and was replaying past episodes, but now I'm back to giving you new episodes, and a whole bunch more new ones will be coming in January. Thanks as always for listening. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. I'm your host, Laura Reagan, and today I'm very excited to be talking with Gracy Obuchowicz. Gracy, thanks so much for being my guest on Therapy Chat today.
Thanks for having me here, Laura.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm really excited to talk with you about your work and your book, Self-Carefully. But before we even get into that, will you just take a moment to tell our audience a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. I always like to start when I'm talking about how I learned to teach people about self-care, that my best teacher was growing up in a family where people did not practice a whole lot of self-care, and just trying to navigate life from learning that and having that be my basic role model. And as I got older, I started to look around at people and be like, okay, people are doing this thing in their life that it seems like they're kind of getting a better outcome from it than what I'm trying to do, which was like people pleasing, trying to be perfect, trying to fix or control other people as a way to keep myself safe, which is all stuff I learned in my family. And when I got to be in college and just after, I really found yoga during that time. And it was when I went into a yoga studio that I was like, whatever this is the thing that I've kind of been looking for. And what it really was self-care, even though I didn't have words for it at the time. And I taught yoga in the DC area for about 5 years, and really just felt like in that space, I was able to really understand a lot of myself and really help other people understand themselves and find self-care and grounding. And I got very interested in Ayurveda, which I think we'll talk about during our conversation today. And Ayurveda, it's the sister science to yoga. So it's a 5,000-year-old science about how to take care of yourself, how to have a body, how to have a mind, how to have emotions, how to have a spiritual life. And the more I learned about Ayurveda, the more sense I started to make to myself, and the more I understood what my body needed. And I felt like the more that I could take care of myself, the more I was not only able to just keep a good sense of self-esteem and purpose in my life, but I was actually able to help other people in new ways that surprised me. So I had this idea to start just a program to help people learn Ayurvedic daily habits because they had helped me so much. And I wanted to do a group coaching format because I like working with groups of people. And I brought a group of 20 women together, and I called it Self-Care 101 because I didn't feel like people would sign up for a course called Ayurvedic Daily Habits if they didn't have a background in yoga. And what we started to do in that course was really talk about what we wanted to do in our self-care, and then also like why we couldn't do it. And I really learned a lot about perfectionism. I learned a lot about the cultural influences on our self-care, that even if we try really hard, there are things that keep us from doing it. And from there, I started to see that this was a really transformational practice. And it wasn't just about the habits, even though those are really important. It was also about coming together in community and really learning how to be vulnerable in each other's presence and learning how to understand the context of the world we were living in. And so over the past 5 years, I've run a coaching and facilitation practice where I help people really find what authentic self-care is in their lives. And I help organizations create culture of self-care where we can begin to honor ourselves and take care of ourselves. And I really think so much of what we're missing in our world is a real understanding of what self-care and what care really is. And so that's what I'm super passionate about.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah, that's one of the things that I'm really fascinated by in your book and what you're teaching. I didn't know when I first learned about your book that it was going to have an Ayurvedic, lens. And I don't know that much about it, but, I love yoga and I've learned a little bit about Ayurveda. It's like kind of intimidating to me because it just seems so complicated, but I'm sure it's not, really complicated. It's just a matter of learning it all. But I love that perspective in self-care is really something that's new to me. And I love that you're doing that. It's really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to look at how Ayurveda is coming into the West the way that I think yoga did 20, 30 years ago, where I think starting off as sort of something that feels very foreign, but the more that we learn about Ayurveda, the more that it makes a lot of sense. And what I always say about Ayurveda is that it just gives us a different framework to understand ourselves. And so really good learning of Ayurveda is being like, oh, that's why I always do that. Like, that's why I always wake up at like 3 o'clock in the morning. That's why I get hungry at this time. So it gives us a different way to understand who we are.
That you said that about waking up at 3 a.m. and that's such a thing for people. I hear that from people all the time. I don't know why I'm waking up at 3 a.m. every night.
Yeah, well, I'm hesitant to get too technical because I think, like you said, I would say Ayurveda, it's intricate, and people go to school to learn Ayurveda in India like we would go to medical school here, and you can study it for years and not learn all of it. And yet I think there are a few basic principles that are pretty simple and easily applicable to our lives every day. So maybe I can explain some of those, and then I can touch on the why we wake up in the middle of the night kind of thing.
Sure. And yeah, you don't have to give the answer to why, but I think just even knowing that Ayurveda can help with that is like, whoa. But I would love if you could explain some of the basic principles, because I think that helps sort of frame our conversation a little bit and might make it easier for our listeners who aren't familiar with it.
I'm happy
and
to.
Me.
Well, I'll tell you what's been most profound for me to learn. And one of the things that I first learned about Ayurveda was that we are not separate from nature. And that is one that once I realized it, I was like, that makes perfect sense. Like, why would I, as a human being, not be connected to that tree that I'm looking outside of my window right now? Like, we're all made of the same stuff. And I think it shows so much of the cultural influence that we can have in the West, that we think that we have dominance over nature, or that we can control it in some way, or we're separate from it, or that nature doesn't care about us. Such a basic teaching of Ayurveda is like, it's all one thing, and that we are all part of nature. And that the more that we can honor that, the more that we start to find this power inside of ourselves. And so a huge part of Ayurveda is actually daily rhythms. And the word in Sanskrit is dinacharya, for anyone out there who likes Sanskrit. And what it means is that there's a way that nature works. The sun rises in the morning and it goes to a certain point in the sky, and then it falls. And if we look at what our, even probably 2 or 3 generations back in our family, if we had any kind of farming influence, especially, people woke up with the sunrise. They ate their biggest meal in the middle of the day. That was what dinner was. Supper was just like a little thing to get you through to the next morning. People went to sleep when it got dark outside, and there was a natural rhythm where we were living along with the nature and the sun. And what's happened in these past few generations is that we have a lot of technology, and I think we feel like we've kind of bested nature. And a lot of us, we're not living with extended family anymore. We're not living as part of cohesive villages and towns. And as a result, we have a lot of freedom in our lives. But what that freedom does when we don't have the routines is it actually kind of brings up like a traumatized response. And the energy of that in Ayurveda it's called Vata. And that is it's basically the nervous system. And that what regulates the nervous system is community, routine, being in nature and feeling that. And I think anyone who goes on a hike and feels better is experiencing some of that calming. And what aggravates it is rushing, adrenaline, feeling lonely in our lives, feeling overwhelmed, not keeping any kind of routine, and traffic, our cell phones going off all the time. So just what we kind of look at as life these days is, I think, inherently aggravating to our nervous system. And that response really, it not only triggers trauma, but it also is just traumatic in that way. So a big part of Ayurveda is learning how to calm our nervous systems down. And there are very specific therapies that are given for that. But the best one is really just keeping a consistent routine. And so when I started to keep routine in my life, I'm like, free spirit, like wanted to do whatever I wanted in my life. And that was a big thing. And once I realized that the actual freedom that I found was through like waking up early and going to bed early and eating my bigger meal of the day at lunch and meditating and doing these things that seem kind of rigid, but actually they helped me start to experience this whole new level of what myself was. And so the last thing I'll say too about Ayurveda, which I think is really profound, is that it's a lot about constitution. And so what it teaches is that each of us has a very specific constitution and that we need to care for ourselves according to that. And that constitution, there's a part of it that's kind of set from when we're born, but then it varies with the season and it varies with the time of life that we're in. So the self-care that we need when we're kids is different than the self-care that we need when we're seniors. And so being able to honor that there are transitions in our life is important. And then part of the transitions that happen are actually, there are cycles of the day, so that are ruled by the different elements. And so that cycle from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. is ruled by that Vata air element, which is the nervous system. And if we are experiencing nervous system dysregulation in our life, it's going to be accentuated between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. and also between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. which is, I know for a lot of people, especially if you're working in an office, you're going to really feel a lot less energy during that time, a lot more scattered, be a harder emotional time. And those are just because it's like the frequency of that energy is just a little bit more challenging for the nervous system at that time. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. How many parents have you heard that call 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. the witching hour for kids? And I never knew why it would be that way. I mean, I knew why they called it that, because the kids are running around, hangry and, wild and not going with the program, whatever the parent's trying to get them to do. I think that's really mind blown for me.
And I, as a parent, I relate to that. And as also just like a parent to myself, I relate to that. I'm like, I just don't emotionally handle things very well between 2 and 6. Like I can check in at like 8 p.m. at night and feel much better about something that at like 4:30, I was ready to like fall apart about. So having some labels and words and vocabulary, and such a big part of what I see self-care is having vocabulary to understand ourselves and call out things that are happening. Because they're not just, it's like, again, you and I talking about this here, it's like, oh, that's not just me. I'm not just like a bad parent. And
right. Or I can't handle it for some reason. Something's wrong with me or my child.
So it's just, I think Ayurveda provides a really different framework, and it is ancient and it is from a completely different culture. And yet I love how relevant it continues to be for us all.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for explaining that.
My pleasure.
I can't help but think as you talk about what you do and the way you're living, what a contrast that is to the DC lifestyle where you live.
Yes. DC it's not a surprise to me that I have a lot of clients here. and that I found my niche here. I have a friend, he's a shaman, and he always says there's great power for you in the city where you're born. I was born in Washington, D.C. And I think about that now. It's like, okay, I don't feel like I relate to the culture here in a lot of ways, but I also feel like a lot of what is important to me is sort of the antidote to where people can go off balance here. And it's challenging for us all. I think this is where we have to bring the cultural element into our self-care, that we're not practicing self-care in a bubble. And if we could just figure it out for ourselves, that we could get it all together, because the reality is especially in DC, it's a very expensive place to live. Both, if you have a family, both parents have to work, and there's a lot of transportation that has to happen, which again is pretty aggravating to the nervous system. It's hard to keep a routine. I know, I think DC is one of the highest kind of like happy hour drinking cities in the country. I think a lot of people, me. Yeah, people like when they're feeling that stressed out energy is what they're doing to try to take care of themselves is just aggravating it. And it's a big part of my work too, is helping people understand the difference between what I call numbing behavior and self-care. Because I think numbing can kind of feel like self-care, because what I say is it like turns the volume down on whatever it is that's aggravating you and kind of numbs you from it, but it doesn't fix it at the root, which is what self-care is about. And I know that's the work that you do, is helping people get to the root so they can actually see a change and have a life that they're not trying to like numb from all the time. But the thing about self-care that I've really had to learn is that it doesn't always feel good. Like it feels uncomfortable, and I don't always want to have to go, sit in therapy or go to bed early. Like there's still that part of me that thinks I could just sort of like stay up and watch another episode of Netflix, and that would just be the answer to my problem, because it's easier in the moment. So self-care does take a lot of discipline, and it's countercultural too. Like it was hard for me to start moving away from the happy hour culture and go to bed early, and that definitely changed my relationships as well. But it also opened up a lot of space to have more authentic connection in other ways.
That's really got me thinking with what you just said, because it's like pulling away from happy hour culture means less social time. And I know one of the things you talk about in your book is, relationships as part of self-care, and how time with important people can be self-care, but, sleep can be self-care too. So if, happy hour means you go and you have drinks and maybe you don't eat healthy the way you would have if you hadn't been drinking, or your whole self gets kind of off balance, and then it disrupts other parts of your self-care routine in the service of the social time. And of course, the alcohol that takes the edge off,
Yeah. And belonging is just so important to how we're built. And I love the work of Brene Brown, because she really is so explicit in how she pulled that out of her research, that like we equate it with love, and how powerful that force is. I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Mario Martinez. He wrote the book, The Mind Body Code.
No.
He's I don't know. I think he's a psychologist, and also I think anthropology background, and he studied cultures from around the world, and he found that the one thing, no matter where you're from in the world, that it's affecting you, is this concept called tribal shame. And I use it a lot in my work because it is just so relevant, that the idea that you're not allowed to like do better than the people that you came from. So you can't, if you grew up in a culture where, people drink, and I grew up in like my friends from high school, everyone, they drank, and it's a happy hour culture. And I got to a point in my life and my self-care where I was like, this doesn't work for me anymore. And it felt so painful to kind of have to like move out of some of those moments, because I really did feel like I was leaving the tribe in that way. And yet I think such a big part of our self-care is, we were talking about this before we started recording, is you have to chart your own course, and you have to kind of leave what has been comfortable and really find your own authenticity. But I think a big part of self-care too is honoring the emotional impact of that, and that there's going to probably be a lot of grief if you have to end or create distance in certain relationships, because you just can't practice the self-care you want and kind of stay up with that rhythm.
Yeah, that makes me think about something else I saw in your book, which is about how self-care is a very layered process.
Yes. And the layers continue to reveal themselves as I continue to study it. And so much of what I've learned about self-care has been just watching my clients work through it and all that comes up for them in the process. Because I think before I really thought it was just about the body and the routines. And it's not about that. Like that is like, especially if you have experienced kind of like trauma in your life and just having a safe feeling in your own body that we can give ourselves through the power of just routines. I think there is almost, I call it like a reparenting process that can happen by just mindfully giving ourselves the bedtime that we need and the meals that we need and keeping our environment clean and doing the things that make our nervous system feel safe. But then almost that safety will bring up all the emotional stuff is what I find. And that's why it's so important to be able to have a sense of emotional intelligence and like emotional allowance. So like, it's okay to feel grief. It's necessary. And I can't actually experience positive emotion unless I feel that, which is so hard in our very like grief averse culture. And so it's like about letting ourselves see that as like a powerful place and really gaining compassion for our own internal lives and our own authenticity. And then the layer, which I find really fascinating because I had no idea before I started doing my work, is that there's this third layer that I found, which is really about community and how important it is to, one, get support from people that really want you to grow. And I think that's kind of the antithesis to that tribal shame thing, is that I think there's something unconscious often in us that wants to keep the people close to us. And that sometimes means like denying them the opportunity to grow or denying ourselves the opportunity to grow. But I think finding and aligning yourself with people that really want you to grow and are willing to kind of like go with you in that process. I don't think we can do it alone. I think the belonging is too strong and necessary to our psyche. And so to find the communities of people that want that for themselves is so important. And then the part that I really feel fitting into this very necessary conversation we need to be having about social justice right now is that the more we get together and that we practice vulnerability and we talk about where we're struggling and why it's hard to practice self-care and why we're just so mean to ourselves or we're doing self-destructive behavior. And the more that we see that everyone is kind of saying the same thing, I think that helps me understand that like, maybe I'm not the problem. And that was what started to happen with my clients, is that we would get together and we talk about the perfectionism and the pushing ourselves and the being mean to ourselves and the denying ourselves the things we needed. And we're like, well, why are we all feeling this way? Like, I thought this was just my personal problem. And that's the term I like to use for that is commonality. So it's really like, okay, if we're all feeling this way, then maybe it's culture. And if it's culture, then we don't need to work on fixing ourselves as much as like, taking care of ourselves, of course, but like maybe culture does need to be fixed, but maybe we don't, is like what I like to say about it.
Let's just pause for a moment so I can give you a little bit more information about why I love therapy notes. I switched to therapy notes a few years ago. I'd say it's about 3 years now, I believe. And I have never regretted it. I was very happy with the EHR I used before, but therapy notes is more intuitive. I love the interface. The customer service is fantastic. And I love how I can get my notes done quickly because I can customize the template that I use for my notes, and there are opportunities to put check marks rather than having to write out the intervention used. So I have cut my time spent writing notes way down, which is wonderful because I like to focus on seeing clients. I know documentation is an important part of our work, but it can also be time consuming, and that is why I love using therapy notes. If you are considering switching EHRs or you're looking for one to use in your practice, give therapy notes a try. You can get 2 free months by using the code TherapyChat. Now let's get back to our interview. I agree with you. And I do agree that we live in a culture that does promote, let's say, self-neglect, because it's like work hard, push through, Puritan work ethic. If you work hard, you are good. If you don't work hard, you are not good. Be independent, do it yourself. Don't rely on others. Don't need others. Don't ask for help. How many times have you heard people say, I don't want any handouts? And that's like encouraged by our culture, as if there's something wrong with sometimes needing help. But in truth, we all need help at times, and we need each other, and we need belonging. We need community, connection. So, of course, there's the old stereotype that self-care is selfish, but it isn't. I hear you saying it isn't just about the self. It's about the self within community and communities of self-care.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much in what you just said. Yes. Well, that's the thing. It's like, as self-care has kind of gotten more into the modern lexicon in these past few years, and I think people want to trivialize it. And I'm like, I see why you could do that if you just are kind of looking at like massages and bubble baths and kind of the way that people talk about it. Except, what is the self is the thing. Right. And I think when we really connect to each other, especially if we're open to practicing vulnerability with each other, we start to understand that, like, well, myself is not disconnected from yourself. And the self is it's this amazing thing, this connection we have to each other. And I think when we can give ourselves space to honor that, it's a lot harder for me to look at injustice in the world and feel like, well, that's them and that's their problem, because it's like, no, we're all in this together, and my suffering is wrapped up in your suffering, and my liberation is wrapped up in your liberation. And so I think a huge form of self-care is to be looking at always at what's happening to the people in your community and how can you be of service, which isn't about self-neglect. It's not about, self-sacrifice and depleting yourself, which I think is so much of the model of activism. Is like, I'm going to deny myself because that's the right thing to do. So I think what's being asked for right now, what we're hungry for, is this really updated view of how do I, feel the sense of abundance inside of myself and show up and be vulnerable, so I can really be in relationship with you and care enough about you that we can start to change this together, especially if I have any kind of power and privilege in my experience, which I do. And so I want to be able to use that.
Yeah, using it for good.
Yeah. And just as something else that you said too about like our puritanical work culture, that I think so much of what our story of the United States is born out of trauma.
Yep.
And so much of what that culture comes from is a traumatized response. And what I've had to learn about perfectionism is so much of what my own perfectionism was and continues to be is really a traumatized response. Like, it's what I learned in my family growing up around addiction and mental illness, that was, if I can be perfect enough, I can somehow keep myself safe.
Yeah.
And so to really start to challenge that influence in ourselves and in culture. And I really think the antithesis of it is, one, it's vulnerability. Again, thank you, Brené Brown, for helping us with that, to understand that vulnerability is powerful and necessary and where we connect from. And then two, I think it's really, it's a concept I talked about in the book called Kaizen, which is, it's actually a Japanese word, and it means small incremental change. And it's used in Japanese business practice. And I like to use it in coaching, and I use it in everything. I use it in relationship, but it's really about how to show up with a growth mentality versus like a right or wrong mentality. And I find it so profound to be like, well, how do I embrace a small change? How do I celebrate that change? How do I look for the next change and get excited about that, rather than feeling like, well, I don't have it all figured out right now, so I must not know how to do this.
Yeah, definitely. And, note that I wrote to myself when going through your book was about that idea of how perfectionism keeps us stuck in our self-care and our personal growth. That was a quote from your book.
It was, I'm so grateful to my clients. I have to keep saying that, because I don't think I fully recognized how deep my own perfectionism was until I started to watch what they were going through. And just that thing of like, and anyone out here who's listening to this, it's like, if you've tried to take care of yourself before or make a habit change and it didn't work, my guess is that perfectionism was part of that. And it's the idea that we're taught this very willpower-based model about how to make a change in our lives, that like the New Year's resolution, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and be a whole new me, which doesn't work. Because our nervous systems can only handle a certain amount of change at a time. And that's a lot of what Kaizen is too. And then again, that idea
that makes a lot of sense, really. Sorry for interrupting, but I mean why it's so hard, because our nervous systems can only accept a certain amount of change at one time.
It's destabilizing. Even if it's positive change, it's destabilizing. We have good reason for doing the things that we do. And the thing about routine is funny because I talk a lot about it, and I'm like, we all have routines. Like, you waking up and scrolling on Facebook first thing in the morning for 20 minutes, that's a routine. And you do it because it's safe in a way, or staying in a relationship where we're not being honored and yet we can't break away. It's because it's a routine, and there's a feeling of safety there, even if it's not giving us what we want. And so I see so much of self-care being, how do we reclaim that feeling of safety for ourselves is not something that's dependent on anything outside of ourselves. And a big part of that is community and support from other people too. But then once we have that, then I think we really have the safety that we need to start to experiment with other changes in our life in a way that it doesn't feel so threatening to ourselves.
Yeah. I'm just soaking this all in, and I'm really enjoying what you're saying. And it's like resonant beyond the words somehow.
I find it so deep. Again, I really was just like, I just wanted to teach people about waking up in the morning. And the more that I've watched people transform through this, whatever the self-care thing is, the more it just it gives me hope actually right now. Cause I think it can be really easy to look out at what's happening in the bigger world and feel hopeless. And I know a lot of people do. And the thing that feels like the trap door of that is that the power of the self is so amazing if we can learn how to access it and utilize it. And it's not something that really takes money. It does take a little time, but not a ton. I think it's more about intention and that question of, what do I need right now? I got that from Kristen Neff, who does a lot of work on self-compassion. And she was sharing in a podcast of, that's the ultimate self-compassion question, is what do I need? And again, we've been taught that's so selfish, but I think it's the opposite of that, of the checking in with ourselves, learning how to be in alignment with ourselves and integrity with ourselves. That gives us so much power, not just for our own lives, but really how to show up for other people too.
Yeah, I love Kristen Neff's work and Brene Brown. And in fact, I learned about Kristen Neff from Brene Brown.
Me too.
And, I'm thinking about that question of what do I need, and what you said before about reparenting and how, working with people who've experienced complex trauma, it's often we parent ourselves, the way we were parented. In other words, if our parent ignored our needs, our emotional needs, our physical needs, neglected us, then that's kind of what we do to ourselves. That's what I think a lot of my clients realize. So even when asking themselves, what do I need? For many of us, it can be like, need? And I've actually had multiple people say, what do you mean? What do I need? What do you mean need? What does that mean? Because whatever they experienced during childhood, they learned to just not have needs. Of course, they still had them, but to suppress their own needs so significantly that they don't even know how to connect to them. So that's one of the things that I think is really powerful about, that idea of the layers, is that you have to start where you are. If you can't identify what you need, if you don't know that you have needs, then that's where you have to start,
Yes. One of my early clients, I still love this question so much. She's like, you talk a lot about feeling your feelings, but how do you do that?
Right.
I was like, that's the best question I've heard. It's how we to go back to the basics of what is it to have a feeling? What is it to give ourselves space to feel that? What is it to even realize we're tired? It took me a long time in my life before I even realized when I was tired. I didn't know because I was so disconnected from my own body, or when I was hungry.
Same. Hungry, tired, having to go to the bathroom. Even those basic instinctual needs can be hard to access when you've just learned to shut it off really, probably so early that you don't even know you do it, so young.
Yes. And I think just the simplicity of what it is to just start to, feed our body again is great about self-care. I love that. And kind of the Ayurvedic hack about daily routines, which I come back to a lot for myself, is if you go to bed around the same time most nights, wake up around the same time most mornings, and feed yourself around the same time most days, like that's going to provide a huge amount of stabilization to your nervous system to start to, look a little deeper in. But it just as simple as like giving yourself some food in a scheduled kind of way, the same way you would do for your cat, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. I think, even just those basic things that you just said are part of when someone is struggling with self-care, or they're struggling, they're feeling extremely depleted. Those are the basic questions. Well, what do you eat? How, what's your sleep situation? How much sleep are you getting? Do you have trouble falling asleep, staying asleep? For people who've experienced trauma, having no appetite, not sleeping well, having trouble falling asleep, not sleeping long enough once they fall asleep, tossing and turning all night, having nightmares. All of those things are common for people who've experienced trauma. And so it's like, you have to start there. Like, how could you really do any other work when you're not going to be, your nervous system's not going to be regulated enough to do any healing if you can't sleep, if you can't eat, because your body isn't getting just the most basic things that it needs to function.
Yeah. And I really think that creating the conditions of safety in our own body is really then things start to come up, in a way that we can deal with them. So not to rush that. It's something I work with my clients. It's like, when you need to work on that, that'll come up. The first is like, is it a safe place in your being right now? And that is really just, it's a process too. And I want to say that out there too, is that I think so much of like a perfectionist kind of self-improvement mentality. And I really put self-improvement and perfectionism, because I think there's this premise that we have that once I kind of feel okay about myself, I can take care of myself.
Yeah.
And that comes from perfectionism, because we need to start by taking care of ourselves so we can start to feel okay about ourselves.
Yeah. So true. Then what you've said a couple times about how once you start practicing self-care and getting more self-care, the things that need to be dealt with are going to come up. So what I'm taking from that is the more you take care of yourself, the more you're going to start to feel more of how you feel inside, which could be not good feelings you don't like, and then how confusing that is. I mean, even like the first chapter of your book is called, well, if it's a chapter, you call it an essay, Self-Care and Fucking It All Up. And like, I'm just thinking how as you start to practice self-care and you start to feel better, and then all of a sudden, as they always use that analogy of the layers of an onion, like it's like you peeled off a layer and now you're feeling all this stuff that you didn't know was there. And then you think, oh, I must be doing it wrong, or something's wrong with me. And it can set you back. And then you give up on the self-care stuff. And then you think you screwed it all up. You give up, and you stop.
Yeah. Yes. That's why I think we need to like have more open conversations about how hard it can be to take care of ourselves and what that brings up, and have vocabulary around it. And there's certain metrics I like to give, is like, is your self-care working? And part of that I would say is like, do you feel full emotional range? And I think if you're feeling kind of flat in your life, I mean, chances are for me, it was denial. It was like I had to come out of denial about a lot of things that have happened in my family growing up, and being able there's a lot of grief that I had to feel along the way. But once I started to feel the grief, then I started to let in like the emotion in general and the connection in general. So
right, because the grief that you hold is why you weren't connected with yourself anyway, because like you said, in our culture, you're not supposed to feel that way. So you just have to suppress it.
Yes. So I think I call it revolutionary self-care, Lex. I think it is a revolution about like, no, I feel sad. I'm going to feel sad about this. I'm feeling. That's the thing to celebrate. And the more we can just normalize that and, talk about how to really how to care for ourselves when all of that comes up, the more that we start to change culture itself. And that's where I always, to me, is like self-care is so deeply unselfish that if we are committed to this and enough of us join together that are committed to this, then culture changes. Maybe not super quickly, because obviously there's a lot of work to do with a lot of people, but the people who, if you're hearing this and it's resonating, it's like, I think almost like we have a responsibility to do this for ourselves so we can help others too.
Yeah. It's like, if you recognize that we're all connected and we're connected with nature, the us versus them mentality can't hang on.
I love that. Yes. We are all in it together. And I mean, another vignette in the book is like self-care and holding space. Just like, and I think it's a hard thing to do, to have to like have a level of consciousness in yourself that you've kind of gotten through caring for yourself and then have to hold space for other people to catch up. I feel that frustration in the bigger realm sometimes. I'm like, we just need to figure out the compassion is the way, and why are we still in this? And how to just hold some space for like how challenging it is right now too.
Yeah, it is. Well, I really appreciate what you're doing. I think that this book is needed, and I love the particular perspective that you bring through this and the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Laura. I really believe so much of self-care is conversation. And so I love being able to talk to you in this space. And I feel it's an act of self-care. And also I learn about it every time I have a discussion with somebody. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're so welcome. And before we end, I just want to be sure that you let our audience know where they can find what you're doing, and be sure to let them know that you have a podcast too, since they're all podcast listeners.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can learn more about my work at my website, which is selfcarewithgracy.com. And Gracy is spelled Gracy. I have a podcast, which is called Self-Care with Gracy. You can search for it on iTunes. It is there. And I bring on guests who like to talk about, who are doing work that I see as self-care, and it's as herbalists and therapists and facilitators, and just how to have these real conversations about self-care so we can all learn a little bit more. And as you mentioned, I have a book called Self-Carefully. It's a collaborative book with a small printing press and a really wonderful illustrator who's a dear friend of mine, Maria Habib. And it's really about how to use self-care as a lens to not only navigate your own life, but navigate the challenges of the world that we're living in. And you can order that book on Amazon or wherever you buy books as well. So yeah, I'm about to step out I'm pregnant with my second baby and about to step out for maternity leave in this next month. But if you do listen to this and it resonates, feel free to drop me a line, and I always love to connect to people, and I'll get back to you as soon as I'm back in kind of that realm again.
Awesome. And I think most likely when this airs will probably be by the time you're just about finishing up your maternity leave. So it'll probably work out just right.
Oh, great. Yes, I welcome. I want to hear about your self-care, because I'm going to learn from you on the process as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Gracy, so much for being my guest today.
My immense pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Today's episode is sponsored by Therapy Notes. There are many ways to keep your practice organized, but Therapy Notes is the best. Their easy-to-use, secure platform lets you not only do your billing, scheduling, and progress notes, but also create a client portal to share documents and request signatures. Plus, they offer amazing unlimited phone support, so when you have a question, you can get help fast. To get started with the practice management software trusted by over 60,000 professionals, go to therapynotes.com and start a free trial today. If you enter promo code TherapyChat, they will give you 2 months to try it out for free.
Thank you for listening to Therapy Chat with your host, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C. For more information, please visit therapychatpodcast.com.